And so I, after graduating, wanted to spend some time exploring and researching Diablo Trust, and it became very obvious very quickly that their version of environmentalism is ridden with racism, colonialism, speciesism, environmental nativism, ableism, sexism. So some of the things that I want to talk about today are how those have manifested in their attitudes towards raising and killing animals in their beef production in northern Arizona. And then also I'll be talking a bit about some of the interviews that I got to do with Border Patrol, and as well as folks working at the Eloy Detention Center in southern Arizona. So obviously the ranchers that we spoke with are raising and killing beef, or cows for beef. So that's obviously an example of speciesism, but they're also heavily involved in advocating against the reintroduction of the Mexican gray wolf, which is another example. So they're, and a lot of the folks working on the Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project in northern Arizona have spoken about being threatened when they try to present at conferences on environmentalism, speaking about the importance of gray wolves to the ecosystems in Arizona. They have experienced threats from these ranchers. So that's something to think about, and is another example of how these ranchers practice and have an ideology of speciesism. So besides raising cattle who eventually are killed for either our local beef market in Flagstaff, only 4% of the cows that they raise are actually sold in our local beef market. The bulk of their profits come from actually the cows that they sell out of state that are raised in confinement operations, which is something that not a lot of folks in Flagstaff know or realize when they're praising this local beef, these local beef production ranches. And then also, of course, these animals are branded, the males are castrated, all without anesthetic, and they're spoken about by the ranchers we interviewed as stupid. They don't feel anything. Their skin is leather. They don't feel it when you brand them with a hot iron. They don't experience emotion. All of these speciesist ideologies are very present very quickly in interviewing the ranchers that we spoke with. They also, in their, not only do they advocate against the reintroduction of the New Mexican gray wolf, they also are training dogs, an army of dogs they call it, to actually attack wolves if there were any. There are only, I think, there's under 50 gray wolves, Mexican gray wolves in Arizona, but they're still raising and training dogs to seek out and protect their cattle from these wolves. And so far they've said that actually hasn't been going well for them, so that's a little bit of good news. And so yeah, so speciesism is obviously rampant. That we expected to find right away. Sexism also is really rampant. We know how the reproductive systems of cattle, of animals are exploited within these various industries, but also there was this whole underlying concept, sexist concept of and construction of nature that we saw like coming up again and again within our interviews. So in their discussion, in the ranchers' discussion of wolves, and as well as of nature, it was frequently painted that like Mother Nature is female, evil, violent. Like Mother Nature is basically a bitch, and we are stewards of the land. Without us, this land would not, this like ecological system would not be here. Yeah, that Mother Nature like can't take care of herself kind of attitude, and that these wolves are much more violent, that nature is much more violent than our capitalist system, than raising and killing cattle in the way that we do. So there was this idea that they're stewards of the land. Also, racism came up often, just again, this focus on their specific kind of environmentalism represented this, or showed this fear of sprawl and population expansion, specifically population of people of color. And they frequently would say, like, if we weren't here on this land, it would be developed, it would be turned into a city. We are the oldest thing on this land, not acknowledging the history of colonialism. Like, we are just basically like taking pride in their history, thinking that cattle ranching is the history of the Southwest and that there's nothing else going on there. And when asked about, because a lot of the rancher families that we interviewed are some of the oldest families in northern Arizona, oldest, whitest families in Arizona, northern Arizona. So they, when asked, asked if they could give any more information on their family's history in connection with colonialism, they would just say, like, yeah, we've had Native people work for us, and that was about it. And then also, very disturbingly, on top of all of this too, there was this underlying ableism that manifested in how they talk about the ways in which they select traits within their cattle for breeding purposes, and how they think that we should be doing that for humans as well. And so this was really disturbing. They even said, just like we see how we shouldn't breed cattle together that would have some sort of disability, we should probably consider doing that for humans as well. And they said that compassion, in fact, may be killing the human race, and that perhaps we should not allow certain people to breed, was another thing that was stated. So we can see how speciesism, sexism, colonialism, racism, ableism, and capitalism all work together within a 30-minute span, like interview with these ranchers who are really praised within, again, the environmental movement and Flagstaff, some of the environmental circles anyway. Okay, and so this all made me, and living in Arizona, having friends who were working with No More Deaths or on the Repeal Coalition to repeal SB 1070, made me more and more curious to learn more about just how perhaps ranchers, vigilante groups, and Border Patrol their ideologies could be working together, and also that they might be working together. And often a lot of the vigilante groups are started by or are made up of ranchers. But I didn't get to do as much research on that as I had hoped, so I'll just share a bit about the interviews that I did with Border Patrol and at the Eloy Detention Center. So Border Patrol interviews revealed, again, speciesism. Even without these interviews, you can imagine that the border greatly impacts wildlife as well as human communities. And that, and there was also not really an acknowledgement of this within the interviews with Border Patrol. Also, there's the dehumanization of immigrants, the continual reference to them as aliens, and the rhetoric that Border Patrol uses is of hunting, basically, immigrants in the desert. And also that there is speciesism revealed through looking at the food contracts with these prisons, detention centers, which are prisons, are usually with corporations that have horrific practices towards earth and animals and workers. So there's speciesism there as well. And also another example, again, is the use of dogs within Border Patrol. At the end of our interview with Border Patrol, they handed out these cards which had different dogs' career stats, like baseball trading cards that the Border Patrol hands out after presentations like the one we had. And so, yeah, this is Rex C. He is a Border Patrol canine. And on the back, their stats are the number, like the ounces of drugs that the dogs have been able to find, the currency that they've been able to secure, and humans that they have found. So this says 0.4 ounces of cocaine, 63 pounds of marijuana, 0.1 ounce of methamphetamines, and 35 human beings. So I can pass that around. Yeah. So again, like these interviews just make it really glaringly apparent how all of these systems work together to enact violence on human and animal bodies as well as bodies of land. When interviewing the Border Patrol, there was also this, again, this vilification of nature and sort of glorification of their work as caretakers, not of the land this time, but of the humans that they find. They frequently talk about how many human lives they've saved in the desert, which may be true, but there is very little critical thinking about why folks are being forced to cross the desert, and then what happens to them once Border Patrol turns them over to the court system, to the detention centers. And so there's also this division or dismemberment of responsibility that happens in the militarization of our borders and the criminalization of migration on the Arizona-Mexico border. So the Border Patrol agents said to us in their interview, yeah, we rescue these people and then, they're taken to housing centers or detention centers, not prisons, to await their court sentences, whatever. They didn't really have a lot of details, and when questioned how do these detention centers differ from prisons, they said, I don't really know, very frankly with us. And when asked, how does it feel to perhaps make a human connection where you feel you've just saved someone's life and then turn them over to the detention centers where you don't know how they're treated, they sort of didn't really have an answer, and then eventually was just like, well, I'm just trying to feed my family. I can't really think too far into it. I do feel like we're making a difference, basically, was kind of the sentiment. Yeah, so then capitalism, obviously, coming into play there. And then also at the Eloy Detention Center, there, again, is this just like division of responsibility. We're doing what we can under the law. We're providing housing, we're providing a service, we're providing social work. We're, again, caretakers, we're stewards in some way of the people under our care, who we refer to as aliens. Very rarely do we refer to them as people, again. So the dehumanization of the folks who are staying there. Yeah, and there's a few other details that I can get into about this division of responsibility at the Eloy Detention Center. So also, the people who are staying there are offered classes, which again displace responsibility onto the migrants, immigrants who are crossing, rather than our political system, which makes it a crime to cross our border. So, and the construction of the border itself as being the roots of this violence. So the classes offered to inmates the ways that these classes were spoken about. And I quote is, "We have classes on not blaming other people for your problems." So that was really not shocking, but just again makes it really clear with how the responsibility is being isolated onto folks who are vulnerable, experiencing violence from the state, rather than actually putting the understanding the blame to be, the state violence itself, and how these different interlocking systems of oppression contribute to that. And then also, let's see. Yeah, so, and then also, I'm not sure where, but this was brought up repeatedly, that the entire immigration system, political system in the United States, like that this phrase is used a lot, it's a consequence delivery system. So how can we punish people to the point where they don't want to cross, is a question that they're trying to explore through the things that they're currently doing to people through our court systems and the Eloy Detention Center. Also at the Eloy Detention Center, just some other disturbing facts. So they are a private prison. They're owned by the Corrections Corporation of America. They're under contract with ICE. Their capacity is 1,596, and they are supposed to keep it at that capacity. That's part of their contract. And then their values, they have painted by the inmates who are staying there all throughout their detention center. They have painted PRIDE, which stands for professionalism, respect, integrity, duty, and excellence. Okay. And then also I just wanted to quickly talk about the few things that I have heard about vigilantes in Arizona. So there have been obvious cases of people shooting up the water jugs or slashing water jugs that are left out by humanitarian organizations like No More Deaths, and also dragging the bodies of animals they've shot in front of those water stations as a threat. So last article I saw was that a coyote had been shot and killed. So we see speciesism again manifesting in this phenomenon. And then lastly, just wanted to say, so all of this, I think, points to how the border is already an intersectional issue. Like all issues, it affects various communities in different ways. And I think that there is hope for an intersectional movement, especially with Trump just being elected, to advocate for the demilitarization of our borders. The Sierra Club Borderlands project focuses on the oppression of animals and the violence against animals that the border enacts, but also works with humanitarian organizations. Dan Millis is the Sierra Club Borderlands director, and he also works with No More Deaths. So we see people doing this work in intersectional ways already. And then with Peale Coalition and Flagstaff, Sean Person and Dr. Luis Fernandez, who both do critical animal studies in some aspects, have been working with this organization. So there's already folks doing that. So I think that it's not only possible for an intersectional movement against the militarization of borders in Arizona, it's necessary, and it's already underway. Thank you.
So next we have Gabriella Jarzembowska. She is from Warsaw University, and in her presentation she plans to focus on the ethical and political aspect of rat control schemes, seen both from scholarly and activist perspective, whereas the situation of laboratory rats is frequently raised and, as a consequence, has managed to gain the attention of the general public. The problem of wild rat eradication is often overlooked by animal rights activists. Free-ranging Rattus nervicus is strictly inscribed in the discourse of filth, mortality, and disease, as they transgress generally accepted boundaries, defy to conform imposed restrictions, and pose a serious threat for social stability. They can be seen as an anarchist figure. Being ecological outcasts, they fail to gain sympathy and support. As a consequence, most countries have virtually no legal restrictions when it comes to minimizing suffering in rat control practices. Therefore, the most inhumane methods, such as broadicomb poison, are commonly used. In places, free-ranging rats in a position of most oppressed species in the world, next to cows, pigs, and chickens. In her scholarly activist practice, she has examined rat control strategies in different countries. Although ethical reflection is rarely visible in legal procedures concerning pest control, there are several exceptions to this pattern. She investigates those practices to see how they are incorporated into the dominant system of values. However, she is also careful as to not overlook the fact that human-rat conflict is one of the most difficult relationships of our species, with no easy win-win solution. She is a PhD candidate at the Arts Liberals Facility, Warsaw University, Poland, and associate researcher at the Seedbox Environment Humanities Collaborator, Linköping University, Sweden. She deals with the critical animal studies with a focus on urban multi-species policies, more than human axology, and pest control ethics. She is also an activist and a leader of grassroots Bios Amigos Foundation, whose goal is to promote animal rights and non-anthropocentric ecological thinking through workshops, seminars, and social campaigns. In her work, she aims at the developing theory-to-practice approach and making alliances between scholarly, artistic, and activist groups, both theorists and, practitioners.
Thank you very much. Do I need to use the mic? Or? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be able to talk about it today, because my PhD thesis is about material discursive aspects of rat control practices, or practices which means usually killing, but not always. And this moral aspect of rat control or pest control in general is one of the most important things in my work, so I'm happy to present it to you. And as was already said, the question of using rats in laboratories has managed to gain support throughout the world, and although the animal experimentation has not yet been banned, the animal rights or even animal welfare discourse has managed to enter the academic debate and persuade more and more people, even some scientists, that animal suffering should be taken into account when we measure overall outcome of scientific research. And but even if we tend to feel sympathy towards rats in a lab, we usually don't feel the same when it comes to their sewer cousins. And well, in fact, we do everything possible to exterminate them, even if it means using the methods that would make us flinch in terror when used in labs. And that's why I'm so much interested in this topic. And of course, rats are associated with many problems such as spreading disease, contaminating food, destruction of infrastructure, or so-called invasions, ecological invasions, which is quite widely used term recently. And they proliferate at an enormous pace. And they are very intelligent, highly adaptive and cautious, neophobic as scientists call it. And as a consequence, people's struggle against them is never complete. Okay, so this is the bare facts, but of course the issue is more complicated. In his article on the status of vermin, Stephen M. Young refers to Alan Garfinkel's book Forms of Explanation to deconstruct symbolic status of animals called vermin. And Garfinkel argues that when one identifies a cause, it is inherently value-laden. He makes the case that cause identifiers attempt to identify a cause they can control. What they really identify is the cause that minimizes their responsibility to their situation. Because it is practical and useful for us to identify rats as carriers of plagues, we are able to justify their extermination and neglect our role in the problem. And drawing on Garfinkel's reflection, we can take a step further and ask, are we capable of thinking about rats as the sick and people as carriers or vectors of disease? Of course, this theoretical step is not to downplay the reality of the problem that rat-borne diseases cause, especially in the global south, but to overcome the dualism, which has nothing to do with the logic of disease, which is also very inclusive and transcends interspecies boundaries. Well, the fact remains that free-ranging brown rat is strictly inscribed into a discourse of filth, mortality, and disease. And I think that they can be seen as anarchistic figures, especially as they offend widely accepted Western rules about purity and contamination. And what is more, if we take a close look at many problems that animals called pests cause, like food contamination, infrastructural destruction, like ecological invasion, and so on and so on, we can all clearly see that rats are always there. I mean, they can, I think that they are the only vertebrate species that can be easily incorporated into all those categories. And as a consequence, I think that they can be perceived as super pests, which means that their status can be seen as a form of intersectional oppression, placing them symbolically and physically in a different position than other, even the most despised species of vertebrate pests. And the fact that they live in large groups makes the situation even harder. Deleuze and Guattari in Thousand Plateaus describe animality as multiplicity, multitude, with the notion of a swarm being an apt metaphor of animal condition. But of course it is controversial from animal rights perspective because we don't see animals this way, but in fact, I think that symbolic status of wild rat seem to fit in perfectly into this description. This is, in my opinion, in sharp contrast with rats in a lab. A rat who, even if physically is placed among hundreds of other individuals, is symbolically perceived as a singular living machine. And this singularity makes it easier for us to see individual suffering. Wild rats are hardly ever seen differently than as a group or a swarm, as Deleuze would call it. And as a consequence, we fail to see individuals capable of suffering. And while being ecological outcasts, super pests, and personification of multitude, rats fail to gain sympathy and support, especially as they usually suffer and die out of sight. Rodents generally become ill and die hidden from human view, which makes their suffering very easy to overlook. As a consequence, most countries have virtually no legal restrictions when it comes to minimizing suffering in rat control practices. The extent of cruelty and indifference to their suffering exceeds any human-animal relation, even towards other species considered pests. Rat management is consistently focused on efficiency and reducing costs. And as a consequence, it promotes rodenticides which fulfill only these demands and leave their humaneness beyond the scope of interest. Therefore, the most inhumane methods, such as Brotificum poison, are commonly used. Brotificum is a form of anticoagulants. Anticoagulants are the chemical compounds that prevent blood from clotting properly, so animals die from internal bleeding. And this is extremely painful and long death. However, the problem of wild rat eradication is almost completely overlooked by animal rights activists. Well, I think that the only campaign, well, it's even not a campaign, but a website that's it's about this problem is a website run by PETA. It's called Living in Harmony with Rats. But I'm rather skeptical towards this campaign. Maybe I will expand on this later on. But I don't know of any others. And the question is why? And the most likely answer is that there seems to be no win-win solution to this problem. And I think there's a clear policy within animal rights or animal welfare movements, even if this policy is more just an intuition than an official strategy, to focus on more clear-cut, obvious cases, such as factory farming, or those with hugely symbolic potential, which makes them easy to be incorporated into cultural narratives, such as zoological gardens that can easily impersonate human gaze. And the vast majority of these cases share a common feature. They enable us to propose constructive solutions. If we don't want pigs to suffer, we shouldn't eat them. If we want to put an end to battery chicken suffering, we should not buy eggs, and so on and so on. And but the problems that rats make, or rather the problems that the situation that we consider as problematic in our human-rat relations, they are hard to conceptualize and convey clear message which can influence public opinion. Another issue that prevents us from getting involved in the wild rat ethics is that we, as activists, while trying to influence public opinion, tend to appeal to people's empathy. So we focus on species that can be easily perceived as victims. Rats can be, and obviously are, victims as individuals, but are they victims as species as well? Well, in fact, they may simply be seen as the bad guys, right? And one can perceive them as our competitors in the fierce struggle for survival. And this type of thinking can be especially seen within ecological discourse. And as a consequence, their status may be too ambiguous for activists. Some animal rights theorists state that we will be able to focus on invasive species or pest management ethics after we have solved more important problems such as factory farming or animal experimentation. However, in my opinion, considering that millions of wild rats are inhumanely killed every year, we should not turn a blind eye on their suffering only because we have not yet found an easy way around this problem. or perhaps with the fun, because at the end I will mention about one thing that seems quite promising, but we're still not sure if it works. So paradoxically, in the absence of animal rights activists' pressure on the matter, that appeals for more humane pest control practices come from scientists who have already examined commonly used rodenticides in terms of their humaneness. As research shows, the most common methods of rodent control turned out to be generally the most inhumane, such as anticoagulants that I mentioned before. And relatively humane methods include snap traps, electrocution, cyanide gassing, and alpha-chlorelose. Of course, relatively, because inventing completely humane methods of killing is extremely difficult or perhaps impossible task. Scientists also developed key principles for so-called humane vertebrate pest control, and if you're interested in this, you can find it in Google when you put Australian RSPCA discussion papers from 2004, and you can find it online. And Mason and Lytton, in their article "The Humaneness of Rodent Pest Control" from 2003, posed following questions: does the practical need for control fully justify the suffering currently caused? Are the practical problems with some humane methods really insurable? And is humaneness currently a high enough priority in the development of new, really refined techniques? Well, no, in my opinion. And over the last, how much time do I have? Can I?
About 15 minutes.
Okay. Over the last years, a new idea emerged within humane pest control to apply criteria used in animal experimentation to both animal experimentation and rodent control. This implies that rat control methods should not lead to intense pain or discomfort, and any discomfort should have short duration and should allow escaped rodents to lead a natural life. Effectiveness should no longer be a leading principle. And of course, taking animal experimentation criteria of humaneness as a touchstone of animal welfare may seem conservative or even shocking from animal rights perspective, but it can make us aware of how atrocious those practices are if the 3R principle can be considered as the constructive solution and perhaps the only option open at this particular moment. And the current trend within rat control, called integrated pest management, whose core assumptions derive from a rodent ecology project developed in Baltimore in the 1940s, clearly state that poisoning is not only inhumane but also a short-time strategy. Baltimore rat study clearly showed that every time rat population is reduced, it is followed by a twofold increase of pregnancy rate over the next couple of months. It is because the decrease of rat population reduces competition for food and mates, and as a result provides better conditions for the survivors. As a renowned rodentologist, David E. Davies, concluded in his paper, elimination merely makes room for more rats. So it is not only extremely inhumane, but it simply doesn't make sense, right? So even scientists say that. And many scientists who have nothing to do with animal liberation or even animal welfare say, hey, it doesn't work, we kill hundreds of animals, and over the next 6 months we start over again because it just not working. And unfortunately, alternative strategy based on ecology requires intensive and, of course, very expensive site management, as well as political and personal will to maintain environmental standards. And it needs to be consistent, long-term, and introduced throughout the city. I mean, it's based on this ecological ecological strategy is basically it's based on reducing the opportunities for rats to proliferate, because if they don't have enough food or of water or shelter, they usually don't breed in such a in such a big strong so fast. And contemporary odontologists clearly affirm the outcomes of Davis's research done 70 years ago. And most of them emphasize that, considering the high generation turnover of rats and their short lifespan, we should focus on reducing their fertility rather than killing individuals. So here, finally, I would like to say a few words about quite new solution, which is not, which perhaps is, well, it's promising, but we can't be sure if it really works. And it's called contrapest. Some of you may have come across it because it was tested in the New York City subway system 3 years ago. And it is simply contraceptive for rats. And it blocks reproductive functions for both sexes. And it was tested in 2013, well, in New York City, in Chicago, and in a rice farm in Indonesia. And they have just fulfilled the registration, because the Senestec, this is the name of the company that invented this. And so they just finished the registration in the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and now they are securing registrations in various states, and I hope they will also try to register it in Europe as well. And of course, controlling animal sexuality is again controversial from biopolitical perspective. And of course, it's worth mentioning that contrapest is not 100% cruelty-free, because they did kill rats during the tests, although they claim the rats were humanely euthanized. But it doesn't change the fact that if it turns out truly effective, that it will be the most humane methods of rat control that we have now. And I think, well, that's all for now, but I hope that we will have a discussion on is it really necessary to control rats at all? I mean, most of scientists say that yes, it is needed, because otherwise, you know, those problems that we have with them would be even more. Even bigger, but some people say that perhaps it's not needed. I mean, I'm very much interested in what you guys think about it. So, thank you very much, and yeah, thank you.
The practical and ideological condition of non-human animals through their display in 19th century America. Starting with Charles Willson, Peale's Philadelphia Museum, and then moving to P.T. Barnum's American Museum, the display of non-human animals can act as a telling signifier of an underlying relationship between human and non-human. Between these two figures, one can begin to see the division among species begin to be called into question. Not only were Peale's non-human static, articulated taxidermy and Barnum's tended to move, but the exhibits appeared to act as a stage to question the tidy Linnean taxonomic system of the 18th and early 19th century. Around the same time as this, there were compelling historical events arising in the mid-1850s, such as Darwin's Origin of Species, the ideas of which circulated in the decade prior. Moreover, the museum became from around 1840 up until the late 1870s, a part of popular culture, as well as a place that reflected the anxieties over the place of the human among other species. The intersection between these historical events and ideology can help us understand the final move in the 19th century. Following the Civil War, one can see the rise of the more serious museums such as the American Museum of Natural History, 1869 in New York, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, 1876. By the end of the 19th century, the display of non-human animals becomes, again, a method of reestablishing Enlightenment ordered by the cold, methodical human hand of science. Matthew Guzman is a PhD student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he studies non-human animals in the 19th century and 19th century American literature. He considers himself an activist scholar, and his work attempts to uncover human, non-human relationships of the past in order to better understand the present and enact social change. His article, God's Best Friend, Vivisecting the Animal in Mark Twain's A Dog Tale, was recently published in the Mark Twain Annual, and he is currently at work on articles such as Walt Whitman's Abattoir and the Non-Humans of James Fenimore Cooper.
Thank you. So the need to define and separate what's human and what's animal shows up from classical antiquity to the present. Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and many others felt compelled to express and outline this distinction between species, all a bit different from one another, but you can bet that the human, or rather man, comes out on top. Interestingly, the display of non-human animals in the 19th century can provide an instructive lens to which yet another manifestation of this precarious and fraught division. There are a few key moments or shifts in the display of non-humans in the 19th century America, which seem reactionary against global and local forces. In other words, the American Museum becomes a kind of apparatus or exhibit through which one can track the relationship between human, non-human dividing line, a border that must be reevaluated and reaffirmed throughout this period. The two distinctive shifts will be charted through two primary individuals in the museums that they owned, and that's Charles Willson Peale and Phineas Taylor Barnum. Okay, so in the famous self-portrait, artist in his museum, Charles Willson Peale, stands with a serious stare as he lifts the heavy red velvet curtain. One of his hands holds the curtain as he positions the other palm up, and his body slightly turned to the side, welcoming a display posture. Partially revealed in this grand room of his Museum of Natural History, then located in the Long Gallery of Independence Hall. Among the patrons that wander about the hall, in the painting one can identify an unescorted woman, as well as a father and son. Taxidermy, non-human animal specimens, each carefully articulated in their own mock natural environment, are stacked up on top of one another, extending down the length of the hall and across the back wall. A taxidermy turkey oddly pecks the ground to his right, and to his left sits large mastodon bones, presumably a sample from the larger articulation, partially unveiled in the back. So Peale and his Philadelphia Museum represent the beginning of museum culture in America. And the museum grew out of Peale's desire for the museum to act as a democratic space where the proliferation of knowledge and education could transcend social class and gender. Interestingly, non-human animals in Peale's democratic space of learning were predominantly static. Like the motionless paintings that the museum also displayed, the non-human animals were presented as either posed taxidermy or articulated skeletons. The museum also provides a clear biological structuring or ordering through its labeling and presentation of exhibits, most notably in the exhibits dealing with non-human animals. The taxidermy was arranged under a Linnean classification with comprehensive labels above the exhibit cases and captions in Latin, French, and English. The Enlightenment, as Linnean taxonomy was a product of, should provide context clues to Peale's predispositions. Under such a carefully ordered and labeled system, the museum can be seen as an extension of a rationalist mind. The non-human is situated within a specific class, no doubt echoing a kind of social class system, which again seems at odds with Peale's expressed intentions for this democratic space. Moreover, it seems here the question of a human's place is less a philosophical crisis and more of a didactic problem, where one can learn one's place in the natural order of things. And to put it another way, it'd be compared to looking up a definition in a book rather than pondering any kind of questions of ontology or epistemology. So beginning in 1842, when P.T. Barnum opened his American Museum, a new type of museum began to emerge. So in lieu of Peale's educational museum space, Barnum's primary focus was entertainment. A focus which ultimately proved more profitable than Peale's educationally driven model. Barnum's American Museum during its run from 1842 to 1868 reflects a kind of testing ground for new and emergent theories of natural philosophy, which most notably, a human, non-human evolution. So exhibits of strange and exotic kind of human-animal hybrids, or so-called missing links, take on an added significance under the intellectual and philosophical problem, natural selection and evolution, that Victorians were forced to confront and address. So Peale's Linnean taxonomy would have found difficult time categorizing something like the Fiji mermaid, the top left. And it seems part of the attraction to mid-century Americans. This is perhaps also symptomatic at another level of another feared mixing of different racial categories, like Native American, Irish Catholic, so any kind of non-white category. Although fake, specimens like the mermaid symbolize larger looming fears within the human species and one's place in a more Darwinian context. So likewise, it doesn't seem coincidence that Barnum introduces exhibits that are alive. Not only can one identify a genuine human crisis, one's place in the world, but those creatures that were once motionless taxidermy come alive. By 1860, immediately following the publication of Darwin's Origin, Barnum began advertising a new attraction. It was entitled, "What Is It?" And its subtitle reads, quote, "Is it a lower order of man, or is it a higher development of the monkey, or is it a combination? Nothing of the kind has ever been seen before. It is alive, and it is certainly the most marvelous creature living," end quote. So clearly, Barnum is playing off of social, cultural, and biological questions that were brought fully into the spotlight following Darwin's Origin. Just as the language that the advertisement uses, one can see a problem of classification. Is this a lower order of man, or is it some kind of higher form of monkey or ape? The attraction had even more crowd-drawing potential because the specimen was alive. Unlike the dead, preserved, jackalope-esque Fiji mermaid exhibit, audiences could come and see for themselves this moving and breathing potential link between human and non-human. But sadly, this was a case of human exploitation. The it in question was actually a mentally disabled African-American man named William Henry Johnson. Barnum, savvy businessman that he was, profited at the cost of his human and non-human animal subjects. Other cases of human exploitation can be identified, such as General Tom Thumb, who was a dwarf, Chang and Eng, Siamese twins, Joyce Heath, who was marketed as a black slave that was supposedly the 161-year-old nurse of George Washington. So Andrea Dennett claims that, quote, "such exotic freaks provided audiences with a kind of comfort," and then she quotes, "reaffirming their self-worth and civility of urban life," end quote. While this might be one possible explanation, Dennett fails to properly take into account the more fundamental anxieties that would have existed both before and after theories of natural selection and evolution began to circulate. The, quote, things, human or non-human, were themselves signifiers of potential schisms or fractures in this older systematic order of Peale's, quote, world in miniature, as it was called. The potential discordant examples signified within such oddities as the Fiji Mermaid or the alive missing link call into question this Enlightenment idea of harmony, perfection, and order. So after Charles Willson Peale died in 1827, his sons kept the three Peale museums going for about 15 years. In 1843, Barnum bought Peale's New York Museum. Then in 1845, Barnum bought Peale's Baltimore Museum. And finally, Barnum bought the flagship Philadelphia Museum in 1850. So entertainment won out over education. On July 13th, 1865, Barnum's own New York Museum was burned down by a fire, and again it was burned down in 1868. So after the second fire, Barnum redirected his capitalist enterprises to his traveling circus, in which he continued many of the same practices, such as non-human animal displays and, quote, freak shows. As the economic principle goes, capitalism must find new markets, and Barnum, one can presume, figured out that to stay in motion assisted in this process. Like his live specimens, Barnum too could not be held in place for too long. So soon the borders between species would be redrawn by a reversion to earlier, more ordered museum ideology. By about 1870, Barnum's style of museums were being replaced by what have been referred to as serious museums. In New York, for example, the American Museum of Natural History opens in 1869, the Philadelphia Museum of Art opens in 1876, and the list goes on. The types of art and natural history museums that people think of today were the products of this final shift in museum culture around the 1870s. These new museum models work to reestablish a kind of Enlightenment legitimacy rooted in, not in the fantastic, but in the cold, methodical hand of science. One might venture to guess that the late 1870s should have been a time in which the boundaries between human and non-human continued to be scrutinized, perhaps even to a greater degree than the decades prior. However, this doesn't occur. So to conclude, so Theodore Adorno in Valery Proust's museum makes the applicable comment that both museum and mausoleum share the same root, and both deal with, quote, objects to which the observer no longer has a vital relationship with and are in the process of dying, end quote. So Adorno refers to the danger in collecting objects without providing an opportunity or a space to derive aesthetic pleasure from the pieces themselves. Yet, if one were to reflect on what natural history museums often contain now, which is stuffed non-human animals or articulated bones, then Adorno's process of dying becomes a kind of strange paradox. The display of the dead in order to preserve and keep artifacts for prosperity. In other words, the museum's content seems to be symptomatic of a fear of death or loss, but it also seems to be an ideological space to either question or reaffirm divisions between human and non-human species. As we've seen throughout the 19th century, there are distinctive shifts in the presentation and purpose of non-human animals in American museums. They begin as static and ordered, product of Enlightenment systems of categorization, reason, harmony, and perfection. Then in the middle of the century, New and emerging counter taxonomies, as well as the exhibits themselves, act as a kind of laboratory to further question human and non-human relationships. And finally, following the 1870s and on, one encounters a kind of restoration or reconstruction of an earlier kind of order in the rise of the serious museums, serious museums where the division between human and non-human are again firmly reestablished. With the legacy of this last shift, it's now quite difficult to look upon the bones and the feathers and imagine that they once moved. Thank you.
So now is our Q&A portion. So if you guys have any questions.
I have one for Mara. Especially in light of like the election and how it seemed like it was a lot of rural white people that were voting for Mr. Trump. I was just wondering if you had any ideas or like connections with people, or maybe with doing education, maybe less with like the institutions, but more with the people, in realizing, like you were saying, the systems of oppressions that are actually at play instead of scapegoating and victimizing animals and immigrants. So I wonder if you had any insight.
So are you asking?
Yeah, if anyone has any, like, if there are any methods of education that you know to work with these ranchers or with the vigilantes in the rural South in general.
I think that's a question that I'm still trying to wrap my mind around and explore myself as well. I think it's really important work, and I think it's really difficult work. I think that right now I've sort of focused more on educating folks who are really interested in social justice, environmental issues, or animal rights to think more holistically about the border. And I've been working with folks who are already interested, at least, in human rights, animal rights, or the environment in slightly more progressive ways than the ranchers that I've spoken with. So I think that's a really tough question. I think that those relationships are really hard to navigate, and I'm still learning how to do that.
Yeah.
But if you have any ideas, let me know.
For Gabriella, could you elaborate on your concerns with the PETA ad about rats?
Because my concerns are about the way they make this message, because they create a message to people how to live in harmony with rats. And in my opinion, we should focus rather on lobbying, to change the law, to try to change the law as it stands, because currently we don't have any law. We in Europe, we don't have any laws when it comes to humaneness of those control, and as far as I know, you don't have it either. So I think we should focus on this, because working with people's attitudes is, of course, it's very important, but at the same time, people are very, there's the fears, the phobias, and all those things, that, rats impersonate all those, that it's worse, the worst, the worst things that we can imagine. And I think that